And we are back with part 2 of reviewing all of the new games I've played in 2025. Just like the first part, I'll try to keep everything spoiler free, so no need to worry about that. So yeah, if you haven't watched part 1 yet, feel free to check that out, but otherwise, let's just jump right into it. I'm kind of cheating again, as technically this isn't a full game, but I find it eventful and good enough for me to include it here. Especially seeing as I love Souls-likes, and I think Lies of P is the best of them. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the story, which I think is pretty great. Following the example of all cool DLCs, this one is set in the past, and it covers the events that led up to the Puppet Frenzy. I think this works pretty well for two reasons. One, it gives more context to things that occur in the main game, and two, even by itself, it's a nice little contained story. And as far as the characters go, they're pretty cool, with Leia, the legendary stalker, and a certain blood artist being the standouts for me. Also, there's another NPC called Rosara that I strongly recommend you interact with. Her side quest is definitely my favorite, and seeing it through to the end is worth doing. On another note, I really liked some of the levels in this DLC, with the zoo and the last level being my favorites. The zoo in particular is just a pretty cool and unique setting to play through, and while it does have some annoying enemies in it, playing through it is pretty fun, and I like how it's tied back to the Alchemist and their experimentations. Now, given how this is a DLC and not the game itself, I'm not really going to talk about the gameplay specifically, though I will cover certain things the DLC added on top of the bosses. So first up, let's talk about some of the new weapons. Simply put, I thought they did an awesome job with them. There is a ton of variety, they're fun to use, and they're actually good as well. For instance, there's dual-wield claws, a greatsword gun, a pinwheel, a bow, on top of a saber called the Rose Sword, which is probably one of the best weapons in the game. In addition to the weapons, they also introduced two new Legion arms, which I really only used one of them, so I can't speak much on it. But the one I did use was pretty cool. With all that out of the way, let's talk about some bosses. Overall, the DLC is a pretty solid boss roster. I would say out of the 8 bosses, there's only one I would definitively say I dislike, maybe 2, but for the most part, the rest of them range anywhere from good to peak. There are 3 standouts in particular for me. First being the final boss of the zoo, which is a pretty interesting duo fight. Second being the Ruin Guardian, which I thought was very unique and the only boss of its kind in the game. And lastly, easily the best boss in not only the DLC, but the game itself, is the final boss. I really love the final boss. It just has so many checkboxes for me. For instance, is the character interesting and relevant to the story? Check. Is the fight itself fun from a gameplay perspective? Check. Is it challenging? Check. And some bonus points here. Is the boss's OST good? Check. Just everything about it I can't praise enough, and honestly, it's probably up there with some of my favorites of all time. Now, onto a few closing thoughts before I get into the recommendation. The soundtrack is pretty good, which, like I said before, the final boss's soundtrack is really good, but there are some great music discs as well, Survivor and Clear Blue Sky being my 2 favorites there. Lastly, this isn't necessarily related to the DLC itself, but rather some content that came with the DLC, that being a boss refight mode. This is such a huge bonus to me, and honestly, I think every game that has bosses as a focal point should have this as a feature. Having to run through the entire game again to get to refight certain bosses you enjoy can just be such a hassle. The refight mode also has some customization to it, allowing you to increase or decrease the difficulty of fights, along with having a little gauntlet mode where you can fight 3 bosses in a row of your choosing, which I think both are pretty nice additions. Now obviously, if you're in any position of thinking about getting the DLC, you have already played through the game before, so if you didn't like the game, don't get it. If you did, then I would say absolutely, with one tiny caveat. It's currently sitting at a $30 price tag, which I think is a little steep as far as DLCs are concerned. So if you can wait for a sale, then I would do that. Though in my personal experience, I had enough fun with it to justify the $30 I spent. In 2025, I golfed with my friends. Do you have friends? If so, then you might like this game. It's fun for a little bit, at least until you beat all the levels, but even still, might be something that's fun to go back to every once in a while. So yeah, would recommend, probably on sale, make sure you have friends to play with, that is all. Now we're getting some JRPG representation with Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana. So I played this one as a deal with my brother. He would play Expedition 33 and I would play Ys 8, which looking back I'd say was a pretty fair trade. But yeah, let's get into things. Per usual, I'll go over the story and characters first. So to start things out, you're sailing on a boat alongside numerous people of all different backgrounds before it winds up getting attacked by a sea monster. This results in the boat sinking and the passengers floating off to a seemingly abandoned island where they start to set up a little village as a base of operations and start forming a plan on how to get off the island. Now obviously there's a whole lot more to it than that, but I don't want to give a full plot synopsis on it. So to avoid spoilers, let's just say you have some intertwined fates, some calamity shenanigans, past events and how they affect future events, and all that good stuff. All in all, the story is quite good and one of the highlights of the game. I think the dual protagonist stuff they have going on with Adal and Dana works out well. The plot is pretty interesting, at least when you get into it a bit more. It does feel a little slow starting out, and it also has a good ending. As far as the side quests go, there wasn't a ton of depth to them, but that didn't really bother me. I think they were kind of fine for what they were. The characters are pretty charming and written with a standard JRPG feel, with Dana being a pretty clear standout from the rest for me, and is definitely my favorite character out of them all. Hummel also being pretty cool. He's funny, so you get some bonus points for that. Now, as far as the gameplay is concerned, it was fine. It has an older game feel despite being released in 2016, although that is likely in regard to it being made for the PlayStation Vita, and then was added onto additional platforms over the years. In the game, you can form a party of 3 with whatever combination of characters you want, each character having an attack style being weak or strong against certain enemy types. So you'll want to keep your party somewhat diverse, though choosing just your favorites is also a valid option. The combat itself mainly felt like a hack and slash with some skill usage mixed in, on top of having some additional mechanics like ultimate attacks and perfect dodges and guards. It wasn't the main draw for me by any means, but I still found it enjoyable enough and it kept me entertained throughout. Though having said that, there is one aspect I'm not a huge fan of, but it's no fault of the combat in particular, and that aspect being the village raids and hunts. For one, I don't find them to be a ton of fun, and 2, they can kind of just pop up out of nowhere, which can interrupt you while you're in the middle of doing something else. Now, as far as progression and gear goes, it's a pretty simple system. You have your character level, which you can increase from killing enemies or doing quests, and then the gear falls in line with traditional RPGs. You have your weapons, some armor, and an accessory. The weapons are just a flat upgrade, but the armor and accessories do have some additional bonuses, giving you some options to choose from. And at least a tiny bit of build variety comes with that, I suppose. Moving on to arguably the strongest point of the game for me, which is the exploration. Like I mentioned previously, the whole cast floats onto an island after the shipwreck, which is entirely unexplored territory, and that means it's up to you to go around exploring it all, which the game also incentivizes by giving you some rewards based on your map completion. Overall, the map has a nice layout, and I enjoy the Metroidvania type design to it, where through story progression, you'll wind up finding gadgets that can make previously blocked off areas in earlier parts of the map accessible. So in conclusion, story good, characters charming, gameplay decent, exploration great. And with all that said, would I recommend this game? If you're into JRPGs, then yes, and I'd say it's worth full price. Having said that though, I do feel like this game goes on sale quite a bit, at least on Steam, so I would just hold out on that. If you're not already into JRPGs, I doubt this one would be the one to change your mind. But if you're newer to the genre or on the fence about them, I'd say this one is worth a shot. Like I said, should go on sale quite a bit, so you can always pick it up for cheaper than its base price, sitting at $40 currently. Next I played BPM Bullets Per Minute, being appropriately named as this is a rhythm-based FPS roguelike. As I've mentioned before, I really enjoy roguelikes, and I also really enjoy rhythm games, and what's more, I've always been a fan of when other genres incorporate rhythm-based elements to them, so this seemed like a perfect game to try for me. Especially seeing as I already quite enjoyed Metal Hellsinger, which is essentially the same concept, minus being a roguelike. Now, I would normally transition to talk about the story and characters, but frankly, I don't even know if there was a story, and the characters are there just for gameplay variety, which is completely fine with me. So with that said, let's just get into the gameplay.
This game is rhythm-based, meaning everything from shooting, jumping, dodging, reloading, and really any action your character can make that isn't just walking needs to be on time with the beat. You'll start each run by choosing one of 10 different characters, each of them with a different feel in how they play. Once in the run, it's just a pretty standard roguelike. You'll go through procedurally generated levels, ending each one with a boss fight, or the occasional skip if you have a certain key. Now, despite being a roguelike, the core of this game remains around the rhythm-based combat, so you're really not going to find too much in terms of build crafting or variety. The variety and replayability comes more around playing the different characters on top of just using different guns that feel different with the beat. You do have a head, chest, hand, and boot slot to equip armor pieces with different effects, though those effects aren't really plentiful or game-changing enough on their own for each run to feel all too different from the last. So as far as the core gameplay is concerned, I think it's pretty fun. It's just as a roguelike, it feels like it's lacking in some areas. Especially considering there really isn't much to the meta progression outside of just unlocking new characters. Another thing I did want to mention was the music, which I think was good for what's there, but I really wish there was more variety. There are different tracks in each zone, but across each run you'll be hearing those exact same tracks every time. And on top of this, the BPM for the game stays consistent throughout each and every run, which I'm sure made things easier from a design and gameplay perspective, but I do think it would have been nice to have been able to experience a little variety in this regard as well. Though I will cut them a little slack here, as they are an indie studio, so I understand they might not have the same resources to create as diverse of a soundtrack that other games might have. Still, at the end of the day, the game is the game regardless who made it, so it's still something I wish was there. On the flip side, a feature I do think is pretty cool is that they allow you to add custom music tracks, so you can play through the game listening entirely to your own music, though you are still restricted to the specific BPM the game works off of, which I think is around the 80 range, with one of the articles I read specifically calling out 88. Now, would I recommend this game? If you think the concept of a rhythm-based FPS is intriguing, then yeah. I think a lot of it boils down to whether or not you think the rhythm aspect of the game is something you'd like or not. Though, per usual, if you're on the fence about it, no harm in waiting for a sale and checking it out then. Moving on from one indie title to another, the next game I played was Cuphead, a game I'm sure needs no introduction, being probably one of the most popular and recognizable indie titles of all time. Having said that, let's get right into it. The story is one about gambling and why you should never quit. Remember, 99% of gamblers quit right before they're about to hit big. But, on a more serious note, basically Cuphead and his brother gamble away their souls, and in order to get them back, they make a deal with the devil where if they can retrieve other people's souls that are indebted to him, he'll give the brothers their souls back. Obviously, there isn't a whole lot to it, but it's the perfect setup for a boss rush, so it works. Which, calling it a boss rush isn't 100% accurate, as there are a few levels per island that are standard side-scrollers where you just need to make it to the end, but I think it's safe to say the bosses are the main focal point to this game. Moving on to the gameplay, I would say it's best described as simple but effective. You have your shots, which act as the different types of bullets you shoot out of your finger, a super ability, and a charm which acts as just a bonus effect. At the very least, this is how it is for most levels. There are some flying ones in this game, where you'll be riding around in a plane with a fixed loadout. Like I said, not a ton to it, but it works out really well for this game. I also like how for the shots, there isn't a clear best shot that makes the others irrelevant to use. Certain shots work better for different bosses, which will be especially apparent if you're trying to go for A or S ranks on them. And speaking of the bosses, let's talk about them. In total, there are 40 bosses, which includes mini-bosses from King Dice and the bosses from the King's Leap, and every single one feels different from the last. Which, yes, I really mean every single one. There is no limit to their creativity when it comes to boss design, and they all just fit the game's aesthetic so well. And as an overall boss roster, I think the bosses average out to be pretty great, and honestly, I can't think of a single one that I downright hate fighting, though of course I still prefer some over others. Some of my favorites being Chef Saltbaker, Esther Winchester, Howling Aces, The Devil, King Dice, Dr. Call's Robot, and Cagney Carnation. Now I can praise the bosses all I want, but the real heart and soul of this game is in its art direction and aesthetic.
The creators went for a 1930s animation aesthetic, being reminiscent of how old cartoons used to look, and the game's soundtrack follows the same trend as well. They really did not take any shortcuts when it comes to authenticity. Everything in this game is hand-drawn and animated, even going as far as using limitations they had back then as well. If you want to know more about it, there's an interesting video from a YouTuber called That Guy Glenn that I'll link in the description. Overall, I think this game is pretty incredible and more than deserving for the success it's received. As for the recommendation, yes, go get it. I don't even think I have any caveats here. Really, I just think this is something everyone should check out, and the $20 price tag it has is pretty fair all things considered. Jumping into another extremely popular indie title, next we have Ultrakill, which is pretty much the boomer shooter and is just plain fun. But to jump right into it, let's get into the story. Now, I know Ultrakill has some lore to it, which is probably pretty interesting, but gonna be completely honest, I can't remember the premise to this game's story at all. I was entirely there to play it for the fast-paced FPS gameplay. So yeah. Same goes for the characters, though there really isn't many to begin with. But of course I wouldn't forget about Gabriel, who's kind of the main antagonist of the game, or at least of what's out so far. He's pretty interesting and has some great quotes. Also plays the organ very well. This game is in early access, so just keep in mind that this isn't what the full product will represent, but there's still plenty to do in its current state. I also think it kind of speaks volumes for the game's quality, for just how much praise it's received, and how much time people put into playing the game when there's still more the developer plans to add. As for the gameplay, it's a fast-paced FPS where you'll go through levels, completing them as fast, stylish, and with killing as many enemies as possible. At least if you care about the grading system, that is. Basically, this game works in the same fashion as other action games, where you're graded on how well you cleared a level, but it's worth as much to the player as you want it to be, as the grade's really just there for you. You can go through and complete levels as slow as possible while just using a single weapon if you wanted. But if you do want to compete against yourself or your friends, there's always the goal of trying to get the highest grade possible on a level, or going for that esteemed P rank, meaning you got an S rank in kills, time, and style, all without dying or restarting the level. For me, I usually just try to get the highest score possible, but not to the point of consistently replaying things to do so. At least until I beat all the main story levels. After that, I went back and got some P ranks in some of the early levels, but wasn't super motivated to go back through and get them for everything. As lame as it might sound, this is one thing that I really like games having achievements for, as they can be huge motivators for me to try and accomplish things that I otherwise wouldn't attempt to do. So fingers crossed, once the game is fully released, it comes with achievements. On top of the main levels, there are also a few secondary game modes you can play. First being Encores, which are pretty much just the main levels, except harder for those who are looking for a challenge. Then you have the Cyber Grind, which is basically a round-based survival mode, and also a Sandbox, which is exactly what it sounds like. I don't have much to say about these, unfortunately, as I really just stuck to completing the main missions. I'll just kind of leave it at that. As for the gameplay itself, I would normally go into specifics and try to cover the different mechanics and what you can pull off, but I feel like this is a game where the gameplay just kind of speaks for itself. Yeah, would have loved to show off some of my own there, but I am not nearly as good. And like I said at the very beginning of the video, I'm going back and recording some gameplay without having touched these games in months, so I'm a little bit washed to say the least. In conclusion, the game is pretty damn fun. If you're someone who is into boomer shooters or fast-paced action games, then I'd say this is a must-play. My main deterrent from recommending it would be if you just didn't like fast-paced games, but otherwise I'd say it's worth a shot. And we are back with the third-person action RPGs, this time bringing another Souls-like with Wuchang Fallen Feathers. It was almost a given I'd play this one, as I play pretty much every notable Souls-like that comes out nowadays, and I'd say I enjoyed this one quite a bit. So the story follows our protagonist, Wuchang, who wakes up with amnesia on top of being afflicted with the mysterious feathering disease. She stumbles upon a temple and meets a man by the name of Xuanyangzu, who gives her the rundown of what's going on with the feathering disease and how it's affecting the region, on top of mentioning that she was traveling with someone before she collapsed, and thus beginning her journey of finding out the source of the feathering and trying to find her missing sister she was traveling with. Also, apologies if I just butchered the guy's name. I'm sure it's apparent, but I in fact cannot speak Chinese. Now, in typical Souls-like fashion, a lot of the story isn't told explicitly to you, so you just have to pay attention and piece a lot of the things together if you want to understand everything. Which, it's safe to say I did not, but I thought the bits and pieces I did gather were interesting enough, and I'm a sucker for any story set in historical China or Japan. But like I said in the past, one of the great things I love about Souls-likes is that the story is never really shoved in your face, so you can care as much or as little about it as you want. Though I do apologize if you're someone who happened to stumble across this video and was looking for some proper story analysis and review, because I am definitely not the person for that. Rambling aside, let's move on to the characters, which I thought were good, and their questlines had that standard Souls-like feel that I enjoy, so my thoughts were pretty positive in that regard. Plus there's a panda NPC who you can trade with, and who doesn't love pandas? Though admittedly I feel like they should have given him more stuff to trade, but that's besides the point. Moving on to the gameplay, I'd say the gameplay is like a traditional Souls-like, but it has certain mechanics to differentiate itself. One being the madness system. Basically, when you die or kill human enemies, your madness will increase, and if this gets high enough, you'll start to deal and take more damage. If it reaches 100%, then the next time you die, you'll have your inner demon spawn at your death point. Killing it will then cleanse your madness, starting you from zero again. If you don't like the idea of having to wait for your madness to build up all the way before getting rid of it, you can also cleanse it using consumables. I think I enjoy the mechanic for the most part, as it adds a little bit of a risk-reward playstyle to the game, especially since higher madness can trigger some bonus effects and skill trees. But it's also interesting from the perspective of punishing players for dying in a way, as if they're struggling against a boss, it would almost just make them struggle even more. So cool mechanic, but not sure how everyone would feel about it. I also want to make a quick mention that heavy attacks can stagger enemies if you hit them in their back, which I just wanted to throw out there as I thought it was a neat addition that I quite enjoyed. You also have Skyborn Might, which is what you'll use for your source for your magic and weapon skills. And it can be built up in several different ways depending on what skills you have. For instance, whenever I would perfect dodge or whenever I would hit somebody with my second attack in my longsword combo, I would gain a stack. Lastly, you have a weapon discipline system, which adds a little bit of customizability to your weapon, almost acting as a second weapon skill that you can choose from based on what you've unlocked for a particular weapon skill tree. I just went full on Monster Hunter and added a counter to my longsword since it was pretty satisfying and was also particularly helpful against certain bosses. Now as far as the weapons go, they're split up into 5 different types: long swords, dual blades, spears, axes, and one-handed swords. Then under each type, the weapons will usually have a certain characteristic that makes it unique from the others. For instance, I primarily used the longsword in all my playthroughs, in which the particular one I used was almost like a whip longsword hybrid, where the sword would extend during swings, giving it more range. Then on top of that, it can also have different stat scalings, so some might just be doing better damage based on what stats you're spec'd into. I tried out all the weapons and I didn't find any that I really disliked. I just ultimately wound up using the longsword as I enjoyed its moveset the most. Moving on to the gear, I'd say it's pretty standard in this department. You get different armor pieces that have different physical or attribute resistances alongside some pendant slots that act as buffs. Then you have the benediction system that lets you slot in 3 benedictions, or basically ruins, to your weapon that act as additional buffs. But the most important thing here is that this game is armor transmog, so big bonus points for that. Last thing I wanted to touch on before getting to progression was the temper mechanic, which lets you use different needles to build out a temporary weapon buff you can give yourself. I mainly used a bone needle that would give me temporary lifesteal, but other times I would change it out to match a boss's elemental weakness to give me a little extra DPS. Moving on to the progression, which comes in the form of gathering red mercury, which is basically like the souls in this game, and exchanging it for a red mercury essence. This essence can then be used to activate one skill in this game's massive skill tree that pretty much encompasses all the different forms of progression in this game. Everything from skill levels, flask charges, magic abilities, weapon skills, weapon mastery, and even more can be unlocked through the use of red mercury essence. On one hand, I do think it's a little odd to have so many forms of progression tied to a single currency, but honestly, I never minded it much. Plus, I do like how they let you reset this tree for free whenever you want, which is always good in games as it allows you to try out different builds without the consequence of needing to spend a consumable for it. Last couple points before recommendation time, the overall boss roster is pretty good, and so were their designs. Also, apparently there's some controversy with them censoring aspects of the story. I can't really speak on this too much as I beat the game before this happened, but from what I found, they made certain NPCs unkillable, on top of some bosses not being able to be killed either, but rather will just sit down or run off or something. I haven't verified what it feels like now, but from what people are saying at least, it seems pretty dumb, and kind of immersion breaking from a story perspective. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not something that would be a deal breaker for me. Now, recommendation time. And full disclaimer, I have seen some reviews still mentioning there are performance issues, which this game is Unreal 5, so that would be pretty understandable, but just from my personal experience, I haven't ran into anything myself. With that aside, if you enjoy Souls-likes and or action RPGs, I would say to give it a shot. That's if performance issues aren't a concern to you. Also, the price is set at $50, which is kinda nice, and I would personally say it was worth it. A bit overdue considering that Baldur's Gate 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, but in August I'd finally gotten around to playing Divinity Original Sin 2, which, spoilers, wound up being one of my favorite games I played this year. But first things first, let's get into the story. The premise is that you are a sorcerer who is also a godwoken, acting as a representative for one of the 7 gods to become the next divine. The divine being pretty much the god, the one to represent them all. And over the course of the game, you're basically on your godwoken journey to try and ascend and become the next divine. In short, I really like it. It's just a cool fantasy story in a world rich with lore, so what's not to love? Plus, the game has plenty of good side quests as well, which I can appreciate. You can tell there was some actual thought put into them, opposed to taking the easy way out with some generic fetch or kill quest. Then, of course, with the story being good and the world rich with lore, the characters in this game are also great. There are honestly too many characters to mention, so I'll mostly leave it at that. But shout out to the Red Prince, Fane, and Losa, as they were the 3 other party members I stuck with in my playthrough. I really enjoyed all of their quest lines, with the Red Prince's development, Fane's backstory, and Losa's inner demon situation, and seeing the lengths we would go to free her. Also, shout out to Malady. She's pretty amazing and one of my favorite non-party member characters in the game, and she's got a super cool design. Before I get into anything gameplay related, I do want to give my thoughts on each act really quick, though I'll try to keep this one brief as I don't want to ramble on as much as I did with Expedition 33, but yeah. Act 1 was quite good. I feel like it did a great job at introducing and setting up some of the conflict in the world with the Divine Order and Sorcerers, and was a great introductory area with still having a good amount to do in it. Act 2 was my personal favorite. A ton to do in it, the area was the best to explore in my opinion, and the side quests were particularly great as well. Act 3 admittedly felt a bit rushed, not a whole lot to do in it, but it does have a pretty eventful climax. Lastly, Act 4. You have some satisfying payoffs to some long-time quests, of course you have the conclusion of the game, some solid side quests, and has some of the hardest fights in the game. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. So this game is a turn-based tactical RPG, with everything during combat being tied to your action points, whether that means moving around, attacking, using skills, or throwing objects. As for the skills, these use varying amounts of action points, depending on the strength of the skill, but these also work off cooldowns. And this goes for mages as well. All spells are skills in this game, which coming from Baldur's Gate 3 was something I really enjoyed, as I didn't feel the need to be as conservative with my spells, and it ultimately made playing as a mage all around more enjoyable. You also have source skills, which tend to be pretty powerful and use up source points. These act more in line with spell slots, being more of a resource opposed to a cooldown. However, source can be pretty easy to obtain, so you really don't need to hold back from using them in battle. Big meteor shower, chain lightning, and onslaught fan myself. Another thing with the skills is how well they play into each other. There are a ton of different skill combos you can use in this game. And just to give some more basic examples, you could use Rupture Tendons and then Chicken Claw, or a personal favorite of mine, Enrage and then Onslaught. That is really just the tip of the iceberg though. You can find a ton of skills that have interesting uses when paired together. In that same vein, mages in this game will be more specialized in certain elements. And to get as much out of that as possible, it's good to have a mage be good in elements that complement one another. For instance, Geomancer works well with Pyromancer, and Hydrophist works well with Aerothurge. Admittedly, in my playthrough, I only made sure I had a point in Hydrophist to get Rain, which paired really well with all my Aerothurge related attacks. Last thing I want to mention about the gameplay was the armor system. In this game, you have two separate pieces of armor over top of your HP, one for magic and the other for physical. This introduces some interesting choices, since as a mage, your gear will have high magic armor but low physical, and vice versa for a melee-centric character. So you can either commit to having the disparity between the two armors, or should you try to spec into stats you normally wouldn't, like strength as a mage in order to get a mix of the two, or maybe go complete battle mage with high physical. Then from an offensive perspective, the two armor system plays into how you'd want to set up your party. For me, I just ran what I felt was a safe 2 physical and 2 magic setup, but I'd be interested in how it would be if you committed to something like a full physical or full magic party, or if that could even be viable while still having good gear for everyone. And speaking of gear, this game has a ton of it. There's all kinds of different gear with differing effects, rarities, armor values, and ruin slots to choose from, allowing for some interesting builds and just selection in general. Now onto the one thing I slightly disliked about the game, being kind of related to the leveling on top of the gear. That being, with this game having far more levels compared to something like Baldur's Gate 3, gear can grow outdated faster, so making sure all of your characters are up to date on things can be a little harder to do. I would run into a problem where I would hang on to underleveled gear for a while because I couldn't find an adequate leveled alternative to replace it. But maybe that's just a me issue, which I could very well see. Last thing I wanted to mention is that this game is co-op, so you can play with up to 4 friends if you want, which is always a bonus. So, recommendation time. If you've played Baldur's Gate 3 before and liked it, then what are you doing with your life if you haven't played this yet? If you like CRPGs and haven't played this, then same sentiment. Otherwise, I do feel like this game is something that people should be able to tell is up their alley or not. And honestly, I think Baldur's Gate 3 is a little more friendly as an introduction to games like this, so if you haven't played either, I would almost recommend going with Baldur's Gate first. But still, I'm sure Baldur's Gate 3 didn't seem like something a lot of people would have enjoyed until they wound up playing it themselves. So I'd say to just give Divinity Original Sin 2 a shot regardless. Switching things up, we have the one and only 3D platformer I played this year with Hellpie. Now, admittedly, the only reason I decided to play this game was due to the fact that I needed something quick to get through during the Silksong wait, and this seemed to fit the bill, which I think it wound up being pretty solid. As far as the story goes, you're pretty much just tasked with gathering a bunch of ingredients to put together a pie for Satan's birthday. Obviously nothing crazy, but it's really just there to provide an excuse for why you're needing to complete these various platforming levels, so it works. This game has a ton of raunchy humor in it, which might be a bonus or off-putting to some, but I didn't really have an opinion on it. It was just kinda there. I was primarily just playing it for the platforming aspect anyways. And speaking of the platforming, I'd say it was solid. You have all your basic platforming movement like running, dashing, and jumping on top of a grappling hook, which was pretty fun to use, and I'd say it was the standout mechanic of this game for me. And it also acts as your weapon, so you'll be swinging that around to kill some enemies. Also, on a side note, I keep calling it a grappling hook as if it's an inanimate object, but I'm pretty sure it's just an angel on a chain leash, so yeah. The levels themselves weren't very difficult, but still enjoyable to swing around. One thing I do wish was that this game featured more bosses.
There's only really 2 in the game, but these made for the more unique platforming sections, and I feel the game could have definitely benefited with maybe a boss per each world you go to. Outside of that though, I don't have a whole lot more to say about the game. There were a fair amount of collectibles to get, so I was kept preoccupied with things after finishing the story, and the completionist in me enjoyed getting them all for the 100%. Overall, it took me around 15 hours to do everything, and I'd say for the most part, I enjoyed my time with it. If you're looking for a short, indie 3D platformer and wouldn't be off-put by some of the more raunchy humor and gross visuals, then I'd say to go for it. Although, I would probably wait for a sale as the standard price tag is $25, but I've seen it go as low as $3, at least on Steam. You've known this one was coming. In September, I played what was probably the most anticipated indie game of all time, Hollow Knight Silksong. Now, I'm not in the same level as some other Hollow Knight superfans out there, but I quite enjoyed it, and I'd say it's up there with some of my favorite indie games ever made. So the question is, does Silksong live up to the hype? Well, let's talk about it. So in the game, you play as Hornet, who has been abducted and taken to a land called Farloom. She manages to escape from her captives and begins her journey in trying to figure out why she was taken there in the first place, with her motivations later expanding to trying to figure out what happened to Farloom as a whole. I'll avoid going any deeper than that to not mention spoilers, but admittedly it's been months since I played it, so I only remember bits and pieces of plot points, so bit of a cop-out, but you know. With that said though, I do enjoy the story in this game, and particularly how it's told. Like I've mentioned numerous times at this point, I really enjoy environmental storytelling and stories that rely on the player to put the pieces together themselves, which I'd say Silksong falls under that category. I also know that Hollow Knight has some pretty intricate lore to it, so that's always a plus, though my own understanding of it is pretty surface level. I never got into the lore the same way I did other games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or Elden Ring. The characters in this game are also pretty charming, Chakra, Eva, Green Prince, and Shrema probably being my favorites. Then of course you have Hornet as the protagonist of the game. I liked the change of pace from the first game, with Hornet having her own personality and dialogue opposed to being a blank slate. Moving on though, let's get into the gameplay, which I thought was pretty great. A big component of this game's combat works off the crest system, where different crests have different movesets on top of having different tool slots. And tools are essentially like charms from the original Hollow Knight, or at least some of them are. There are 3 different types, red being offensive, blue being more defensive oriented, and yellow just kind of being miscellaneous, like having enemies drop more trinkets, or my personal favorite, the compass, which shows an indicator for your location on the map. Which, yeah, I know, kind of a wasted slot, but not for me because I'm god-awful at reading maps. Overall, I thought the system was pretty good and allowed for some nice variety for how you'd want to approach the game. For instance, you might have one crest that works better for certain areas or bosses, while others might work better for you elsewhere. And to be more specific, the platforming. I know there were a lot of people out there mentioning how platforming with the standard Hunter crest was difficult because of the diagonal downswing. So if that was something you struggled with, you could switch to an easier crest like the Wanderer, which has a moveset more reminiscent of the Knights from the first game, making pogoing a lot easier to do. Then you have Silk, which acts as the resource to both heal yourself and use skills. Honestly, can't speak on skills too much since I almost exclusively use Silk for healing in this game, so yeah. But they were neat for the little I did use. But moving on, I want to briefly go over the enemies and bosses. For the enemies, I wanted to comment on 2 main things, one being the enemy variety. If you look at the bestiary, it's probably close to 200, if you exclude the bosses. So huge props to Team Cherry on that, you can't go wrong with more variety. The second one being a 2-heart or a 2-mask problem I think the enemies have. Simply put, I think there are way too many enemies that have attacks dealing 2 masks of damage to you. I can understand making it so larger enemies or hard-hitting attacks do that, but to me they just went a little overboard on this one. I don't even think I could begin to count just how many small enemies have some sort of multi-swipe attack that hits you for 2 masks. Moving on to the bosses, I think as a collective they would probably average out to be good. There's some really amazing ones, but there's also just some random ones that just aren't the best.
especially if you want to get into the encounter rooms. Not really sure what to call them as they aren't exactly bosses, but they're more of a gauntlet you have to clear in order to progress, though I wasn't going to include them. Like I said though, there are some really great bosses in this game. My favorites being First Sinner, Cogwork, and the Clover Dancers, Seth, Widow, Grandmother Silk, Carmeletta, and my absolute favorite, the final boss. Moving on, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the progression and the map. Similar to Hollow Knight, this game has a ton of secrets for you to find and doesn't really hold your hand when it comes to exploration. The general progression and how you got all the different movement and traversal options felt good, and always kept me on my toes to try and mark different places on the map I knew I'd have to come back to. There were some shittier areas that I didn't care all too much for, like you could probably just go ahead and nuke the whole top right of the map and you wouldn't hear any complaints from me. Though, to be fair, I guess every great game has to have its poison swamp level, right? Plus, I can forgive them a little bit for it, as they also made Coral Chambers, which is probably one of my favorite areas across both games. Which also makes for a great transition into the soundtrack, as it was pretty great, especially the Coral Chambers soundtrack. But outside of that, some of the bosses have some pretty solid ones as well, Carmeletta being a standout here. Two final things I want to go over before the recommendation is that one, I wasn't really a fan of the two currency system. I wouldn't really say was terrible, but more just unnecessary. I think they should have either committed to doing more with the shards, or just threw them out entirely and have the red tools just refreshed to their max capacity for free. And second, this isn't really a negative, but I wish they leaned into the platforming a bit more. I'm not sure if I'm alone in this regard, but I find the platforming in this game to be pretty fun, and I wish there were some harder challenges with it. Something more in line with some of the parkour you have to do to get one of the secret endings. So, with all of that said, does Silksong live up to the hype? I would say for me, yeah. Though, I also wasn't one of the people expecting this to be the best thing since sliced bread. I really just expected it to be better than the first game, which, in my opinion, is what I got. Now, would I recommend it? Unless you just know you hate Metroidvanias, then absolutely. It's only $20, which is a complete steal for what you get. Next up is a premium game for premium gamers with Borderlands 4. Now, I'd say I'm a pretty big fan of the franchise. I've played all the games outside of the newest Telltale one, and if we're looking at Borderlands 2 specifically, I probably have over 1,000 hours into it. So safe to say this was another one I was quite looking forward to, especially since I've heard initial impressions from people were positive. But anyways, per usual, let's get into the story first. This game takes place on a planet called Kairos, where the Vault Hunters are captured and implanted with a device called a bolt, which allows them to be controlled by the Timekeeper. They eventually escape and temporarily free themselves from his control, in which they then begin their journey to kill the Timekeeper, freeing the planet from his tyranny, and ultimately open the planet's vault. Now, I find this story to be decent. I think it's arguably in contention for the best story in the franchise, alongside 2, though Handsome Jack is still comfortably the best villain and character in general. I wouldn't necessarily say Borderlands games are really known for their stories, so I wouldn't really consider it a high bar to meet. Also, I think this game does a better job at balancing a more serious tone while still maintaining its humor. And speaking of the humor, I think that's something they also did well in this game, or at the very least, much better than Borderlands 3. Some of the quests got a genuine laugh out of me, like the Thresher breeding one and the Flat Earth one, which, low-key, the Flat Earth one is probably one of my favorite quests in the franchise. Another thing I liked is how the story didn't rely too much on returning characters and went out and created some cool new ones, like Rush, Calder, Levain, and Zadra. Though, admittedly, I do hope we get some more returning characters in the DLCs. Something I disliked about the story is that I think a certain twist at the end falls a little flat, and there really isn't much done with it. Probably needed to leave that plot point in the oven a bit more. The last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the gameplay is that the side quests in this game are pretty solid. I briefly touched on some of them when going over the humor, but yeah, I don't have much else to say outside of the fact that I liked them. With that out of the way, let's move on to what this series is known for, which, to kick things off, I think from a gameplay perspective, this is the best the series has been. The gunplay is very smooth, and the builds in this game have been pretty fun to mess with. I also think the inclusion of the rep kits was a phenomenal decision. Gone are the days where you had to rely on alternative methods to heal, like character skills, health drops, or if you're playing Ultimate Vault Hunter mode in 2, then the grog nozzle was practically mandatory. It also gives one additional slot to work with when build crafting, which is nice. Then you also have firmwares, which adds another layer to the build crafting, and having them be transferable between equipment was a nice touch. This game also feels good from a progression perspective. It just felt satisfying and well done. I don't have too much to say on it outside of that, really. Moving on, the next thing I want to briefly talk about is the loot pool. They did a great job at making it so legendaries and rare drops actually feel rewarding again, and making it so enemies have dedicated loot drops, which I know should technically be the standard at this point, but I'm not going to forget about the fact that 3 didn't have them initially, so props to them for not messing that one up twice. But moving on, I did want to briefly touch on the endgame, which I know some people have complaints about, and that it feels like there's not much to do. I can't say I really agree with this sentiment completely. If you compare the base game of 4 to other entries-based games, I feel like there's just as much to do. Plus, you have additional leveling with specialization points, so you can always keep progressing your character while sitting at max level, which is nice. Then you have some pretty good quality of life features they added, which I'm a fan of. Stuff like being able to dodge, summon a car wherever you're at, and being able to resummon bosses without having to quit and reload was a huge bonus. And I guess also to the dodging point, the movement in this game is just good in general. I think it's a step up from previous entries, and being able to actually dodge is such a game changer when it comes to fighting bosses. The last thing I want to touch on was the collectibles and open world. As far as the open world is concerned, I thought it was fine. I don't really have too much of an opinion on it. I think it's an interesting direction for the game to go, but I can't say I definitively prefer it to how the older games were or anything. Then I'd say I have similar feelings to the collectibles, though I know some people aren't a fan of how tedious it can be to collect them all, but the completionist in me didn't really care all too much about that, though I do hate the shitty capsule ones. So, recommendation time? Not yet. There is one final thing I need to touch on before giving my thoughts, that being the performance. As what feels like every game suffers from that's made in Unreal 5, this game has had heaps of people having issues with the game's performance, which just sucks. I haven't had as bad of an experience as others are having with it, though there are some instances where I notice the game can be stuttery and loading times take a while. Plus I've dealt with a few crashes over the course of my time playing. So yeah, with all that out of the way, would I recommend this game? If we were just talking about the game itself, then yes, I think I'd recommend it to almost anybody. However, given the state it's in and how many people seem to be having issues with it, I'm not sure that I could recommend it in good faith. So if performance concerns don't bother you, then go for it. Otherwise, it might be smart to hold off until later for some more fixes to come in. I am once again kinda sorta breaking the rules, since technically I played this last year, but technically that was the early access version, with the full version releasing this year, so we're counting it. Plus, I really like this game, so of course I'd want to include it. The story falls under the simple but effective category. Kronos has taken over the underworld, and you need to stop him. It also happens to work really well for roguelike, as it provides actual reasoning for why you're having these repeated runs, and can't just kill Kronos off the first time you get to him. On top of how you can continue to do runs after you've reached your ultimate goal of defeating him for good. Then you have the characters, which I like all of them. My favorite being Malinaway, but that's probably to be expected. Also just want to say that the character designs in this game are pretty amazing, especially Chaos's. And finally, I have to get my obligatory Ben Starr mention out of the way, as he does in fact voice Prometheus in this game. But with all that said, let's get into the gameplay. You'll be venturing into the underworld, completing 4 different floors with procedurally generated areas, gathering different items and god boons to put together a build that can hopefully beat Kronos. The runs manage to avoid feeling repetitive, as there are a ton of different ways you can set up a build through your Daedalus hammers and god boons, which act as your effects or buffs to yourself. For instance, a Zeus boon will primarily have lightning based effects, so you could pick up a boon from him and make it so when you run around, lightning will strike enemies, or a Daedalus hammer might make it so your normal attacks split out into 3. And another thing I wanted to mention was that they added running and mana into this game. The running is honestly just a great feature to have and adds some additional boon effects you might find. Then you have mana, which is a great addition that adds an additional layer to the combat. With mana, it introduces Omega attacks, which are charge attacks you can use for your normal, special, or cast. Of course, this adds the additional layer to the weapon's movesets, but there are also plenty of boons and hammers that work off these as well. On top of the things you might find during a run, there's also the stuff you will choose before each run begins. One being a starter keepsake, which will just add some sort of bonus effect to yourself. For instance, a lot of the time I'll wind up running a keepsake from a god, guaranteeing I'll find a boon of theirs because I know I want a specific thing from them for a build I'm trying to go for. And these can also be traded out between each floor in a run, so you're not restricted to having the same one the whole time. Then you have Arcana cards, which is a new mechanic in this game that wasn't in Hades 1. These act somewhat similar to keepsakes, as they're typically buffs and effects added to your character, but these go a little more in depth because there's a lot more choice when it comes to them. Basically, each card requires a certain amount of grasp to activate, so you have to pick and choose based on your grasp limit, with certain cards only being activated based on conditions met with others. For instance, there's a card that will activate if you activate 5 cards in a row from a specific column or row, or a card that will activate if you're activating a total of 3 cards or less. I really enjoyed this system as it adds more depth to how you can play the game and subsequently more build diversity. Then you have animal familiars, which act as both a companion on top of having other effects they can grant you. And then on top of that, there's the fear system, which is basically the heat system from Hades 1, where you can start the run with additional effects or debuffs to make runs harder if you're looking for a challenge, or if you're a completionist and want all the achievements. Now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the weapons, as they might just be the most notable thing you can switch up between runs. So in this game, you'll have 6 weapons to choose from: the Witch's Staff, Sister Blades, Umbral Flames, Moonstone Axe, Argent Skull, and the Black Coat. Though starting out, you'll only have the Witch's Staff, but you unlock more as you progress. For each weapon, they all have 4 different weapon aspects that each have unique characteristics, making them slightly different, or in some cases significantly different, than others. So in a way, you could almost make an argument that there's 24 weapons in the game, which I could almost be inclined to agree with. But if you don't want to go that far, there's probably a stronger argument to be made for 12, as each weapon has a hidden aspect that you can unlock that has a completely different moveset than what the base one has. I'd say I liked all the weapon types outside of maybe the Black Coat, as they all had at least one weapon aspect that I found enjoyable to use, with my favorite weapons of the bunch being the Sister Blades and the Umbral Flames. So hopefully I covered all the cool stuff this game has in terms of what you can customize to set up each run, on top of what you might be able to expect during the run, so at this point you should be ready to take on the Underworld. But what if you grow tired of doing runs in the Underworld? Well, you're in luck, because further in the game you'll be able to do runs on the surface as well, having 4 completely different floors to run through. This keeps things fresh as they have 2 completely separate feels to them, and this just adds even more replayability to what I consider an already very replayable game. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about the progression, which I think Hades 2 is the king of all roguelikes when it comes to its meta progression. Not only is there a ton to it, but through completing or even failing each run, I always feel like I'm progressing in some meaningful way. Whether that's through finding ingredients to complete an incantation, fulfilling a prophecy requirement, or even something as simple as being able to progress characters' dialogue. I absolutely love this about this game, as I feel some roguelikes don't put much emphasis on meta progression and solely rely on their gameplay loop being good to keep players entertained, which I do want to say isn't inherently a bad thing. Not every game has to have as deep of meta progression as Hades 2 does. But it's safe to say I am a fan of it, so I figured I'd call it out. And here we are, recommendation time. I guess I'll just start it out by saying this is my favorite roguelike of all time, and arguably my favorite indie game of all time, alongside Crosscode. So, unless you're someone who just hates roguelikes, then I absolutely recommend this game. Battlefield 6. One of the biggest multiplayer titles of the year, with it certainly being the main multiplayer game I was looking forward to, at least from a PvP perspective. Now, I wouldn't call myself a Battlefield super fan or anything, but I do enjoy some of them quite a bit, with Battlefield 4 being one of my favorite FPSs ever made. So does Battlefield 6 live up to the hype for me? Kind of. There are definitely aspects I dislike, but for the most part, I had a good time with it. To start things off, I think I'll just go ahead and cover the things that I didn't like, so we can end this section on a more positive note. So, first thing I'll go over is the maps. Now there are 10 maps in this game, at least at the time of writing this, but if you're like me and only play Conquest, then you're only going to experience 9 of them. And out of those 9, I'd say I really only like maybe 2 of them, Siege of Cairo being my favorite. I feel like there's just too many close quarters maps, or there needs to be a little more variety in letting some of them breathe a bit more, if that makes sense. You know, I think there's something to be said when there was a challenge for getting 200-meter sniper headshots, and the only map you're really consistently going to get these is Operation Firestorm, which isn't even a Battlefield 6 original map. Granted, they did drastically reduce the amount needed for that challenge, but let me say as someone who had gotten it when it was sitting at 150 kills, that took an incredibly long time to do. The next thing I want to cover is the lighting. Now, I'm all for immersion and having more dynamic lighting, but I feel like there needs to be options available where you're able to have more consistent lighting across the map. For instance, sometimes when you're outside and looking into a building, it's dark to a point where you might not even be able to see an enemy that is capable of seeing you just fine. And on the flip side, sometimes when running out of buildings, it feels like you're being hit with a mini flashbang. Apparently, they've released some updates to help with it, but I haven't really been able to notice much of a difference. Next, I want to briefly cover RedSec, which is this game's battle royale, because every game just needs to have one for some reason. I'll keep this short. I'm not a big fan of battle royales, so I can't say I had much fun playing this one for the small amount I did, but that's just me. No harm if you like it. Well, I do have some more minor gripes, like the support class feeling like it has too much utility and how some of the progression unlocks work, like not being able to have C4 by default in the recon class. To avoid rambling on for too long, I'm just going to move on to some of the positives. First being the general feel and gunplay of the game. I don't really have too much to say here, outside of the fact that it just feels clean and responsive. And to add on to my feel comment, while the maps do leave some to be desired, the game still has that Battlefield feel that I love. The last thing I want to cover isn't necessarily about the game itself, but more around the team that's responsible for the game. The specific case I want to mention is that they made a change to lower the ticket counts on different maps, making it so the games went faster. Players were vocal about this change being bad, as it kind of removes some of the more tense and fun moments where it's a close game, but it doesn't end based on the tickets. The time just runs out, leaving for a bit of an anticlimactic ending. Pretty shortly after, this change was reverted, and they actually upped the 30-minute time limit to allow games to end naturally, opposed to running out of time. I think this is just important to highlight, as showing they are capable of listening and taking player feedback to heart is always nice to see, and I hope they keep up with this trend going forward. With all of that being said, despite the $70 price tag, I felt it was worth it to me. As with multiplayer games like this, I always feel like you can get quite a bit of time and enjoyment out of it, especially if you're playing with friends. If after watching some gameplay and doing a little research, it's only mildly interests you, then I think it's something that would be worth giving a shot when it's on sale. Now moving on to what might be the biggest surprise of the year for me with Where Winds Meet. Having seen the trailers for this game, on top of the fact it was advertised to be a free-to-play, open-world action RPG, I was pretty skeptical going in, and had set my bar pretty low in order to not be disappointed. I was fully expecting to find a game I would play a couple hours, only to find it riddled with microtransactions with a pay-to-win model, as I feel a lot of similar games would fall in that category. However, it's safe to say I was pleasantly surprised, as what I found was actually a pretty fun game. Getting into the story and characters, I thought they were solid. The main story starts off a little slow to me, but picks up quite a bit and has a pretty crazy conclusion to Chapter 1. Then for what I had played for Chapter 2, things were going good here as well. And as far as the side quests go, they were fine, but there were definitely some standouts that I thought were pretty decent. Don't have a ton to say here, outside of the fact that it was certainly better than I was expecting, and for the most part, I thought they did a pretty good job, especially given what the game is. Moving on, let's talk about the gameplay, which I think is pretty great. The combat doesn't stray far from what you might expect from other action RPGs, though it's still very smooth and responsive. You have your standard movesets, which come from a mix of what weapon you're using, on top of what martial art you're using for them as well. For instance, in my case, I use the sword a lot, which I can either choose the nameless sword or the strategic sword martial art, each coming with their own movesets and skills. And the game also gives you two weapons you can swap between, which flow pretty seamlessly together in combat. On top of weapon skills, you also have things called inner ways, which act as different buffs for your character, whether that's in the form of damage, support, defense, or some other miscellaneous form. Then you have mystic skills, which are 8 different skills you can have on, and similar to your inner ways, come in different shapes and sizes, with 4 of them being puzzle skills you'll likely want to have on, as they come in handy for general exploration and, if you can believe it, solving puzzles. Moving on, let's talk about the gear and progression. As far as the gear goes, you can have 2 weapons, 4 pieces of armor, 3 accessories, and a bow to work with. Each piece usually coming with 1 random effect on top of having a set bonus. Then you also have the option to level them up or tune them, which is basically just adding some additional enhancements to them. Don't have too much to comment on with this, as they had a system in the game where there were time gating level caps. So I never got into build crafting and just used the best available stuff I had at the time. So I'll mainly just leave it at that. But I will say it felt like a fine system to me. And the thing I do want to point out that I thought was pretty cool is that they have build guides in the game, giving recommendations for builds people can use, listing weapon combinations, what gear to go for, what set bonus to look at, what inner ways to use, and even what tuning you should try to get. Nothing crazy, but a pretty neat feature to have, especially for a more casual player that might not be looking up all the best builds and where wins meet patch 6 new meta updated videos. Now, as far as progression is concerned, it comes in various different forms. First being a standard leveling system where you get XP for completing quests, killing enemies, and just doing mostly about anything in the world. This both makes you stronger, on top of giving you access to different systems and activities the higher you get. There are also level caps you'll need to break through in order to get past them. For instance, to get past level 50, you have to complete certain trials in order to break through and have the cap get upgraded to level 55. They are also capping all the players' levels and drip feeding additional level caps over the weeks, which I'm guessing they're doing that just to keep players engaged and so they keep coming back, but I didn't have much of an issue with it. Plus, one thing I really like that they do is even when your level is capped, all of the XP you earn is stored and will be given back to you when the next level cap is unlocked, allowing you to reach the next cap much faster. Now, there are a ton of different pieces of progression at work, and it would be pretty impossible for me to cover each one without having this video stretch on forever, so I'll just briefly list all the different forms of progression there are. So with that said, you have oddities, talents, having 3 different branches of talents, professions, both healer and scholar, various things in the Wandering Paths mode, PvP ranks, guilds, sects, and of course a battle pass. So in conclusion, if you like the dopamine hits of feeling constant progression in one form or another, then this might be the game for you. I know full well that it can be pretty overwhelming, and admittedly, it kind of is, but you do get used to it over time. Now, to be blunt, this game has far too many things going on for me to even scratch the surface of all of it, so I'm going to try to end this off with giving some more rapid-fire thoughts on things I want to cover without going too in-depth on them. And with that said, let's begin. Open world was cool, bosses were great, Tian Yang being pretty damn difficult, kicking my shit in for like 3 hours. Plus, Qianye is probably one of the coolest bosses from this year, with one of the most aesthetic boss arenas I've ever seen. Everything from a customization standpoint is awesome, character creation is good, and the game has a ton of different ways to make your character or profile unique. Also, has probably one of the most in-depth die systems I've ever seen in a game. From a monetization standpoint, the game is good and bad, but I will mostly defend them on this point, as the game is free and not pay to win. Everything is purely cosmetic that you can buy, though I will not defend just how expensive some of the skins are. This game can be overwhelming, which is a double-edged sword. On one hand, this game does offer a ton of things to do, with a ton of different systems to interact with. However, this is extremely overwhelming as a new player, and it almost put me off of the game at first. After having put more time into it though, I think I mostly enjoy this aspect, but it can still feel like they're doing too much at times. The UI requires a rocket science degree to navigate. I think the 1,000 different activities and systems don't help it in this regard, as there are like 50 menus, each having 20 different sub-menus. And while I had mostly gotten used to it, I still wound up getting lost from time to time. And from a community and multiplayer perspective, I think this game is awesome. I have admittedly played mostly solo, as none of my friends are into this game, but you can play co-op or join an online server and interact with one of the various mini-games you can play with people. There's even one that's basically a rhythm game, which I quite enjoyed. Players can also leave messages on the ground that other players can see, similar to Dark Souls, except for better or for worse, aren't restricted in what you can say. They were pretty nice if you didn't want to rub two brain cells together to do some of the puzzles, and some even got a good laugh out of me. Then from a fashion standpoint, people can share their characters for others to download on top of outfits, dye combinations, hairstyles, and more that other players can view and have the option to copy. But yeah, with all of that out of the way, let's get into recommendation time. Which, seeing how this game is free, so long as you enjoy action RPGs, I'd recommend it to anyone. This game has a ton of things going on in it, and it can certainly be overwhelming at first, but I found that it's something the more you play, the more you can enjoy it. So I'd say to check it out, stick with it a bit, and maybe it's something that you can really get into. The last game I played in 2025, or at least the last one before I make this video, is one I'm currently playing, being Unbeatable. I had played the demo back in 2021, which I quite enjoyed, and given my love for rhythm games in general, it's safe to say that I've been looking forward to its release for a while. And so far so good. From the 15-ish hours I've played, I only have mostly positive things to say. But with that said, let's get into the story and characters. This will be pretty quick as I'm not too far into the story, but from the little I have played, it's been decent. The characters are charming, and I've liked the rhythm-esque minigames they've thrown in. I'd say my favorite thing about it so far is probably the visuals. It looks great from an art style perspective, and I love the blend of 2D and 3D they have going on. The game just feels very expressive in all areas, which I can appreciate. As for the gameplay, it's mostly self-explanatory being a rhythm game and all, but the main gimmick that sets it apart is the multi-directional song charts. And what I mean by that is that there are two different ways that notes will come in, either from the left or the right, where the song will usually switch between them for different sections. Then on top of that, there will be instances where notes will come in from both sides at the same time. For the most part, I think this makes for a pretty fun gimmick, and while it can feel overwhelming at first, once it clicks, it clicks. I really don't have a whole lot of bad to say about the game, though the one thing I'm not a huge fan of is that there's a couple songs where the chart direction will switch and will require you to hit a note what feels like not even half a second after. Like I said, this is only applicable to very few songs, but I do feel like these are instances that rely more on memorization opposed to being able to sight read. Which might be fine for some, but I tend to hardly ever play the same song twice in a row, so I mainly just sight read without having the full chart memorized. Moving on to some more positives though, one feature that I really like from this game is that you can customize the speed of the beat map. This is great as it adds more customization to how you can experience songs. For instance, maybe you struggle with some of the harder difficulties, but you still want more of a challenge. In that regard, you could choose an easier difficulty so the song chart isn't as complex, but up the beat map speed so it feels a bit harder. Or in the opposite direction, maybe you're trying to learn a hard song so you choose to lower the speed so you can get a better feel for how the song plays. And speaking of the songs, the music in this game is pretty solid. There's a lot of variety, having 76 songs in the base game and 87 if you got the Breakout Edition, and I'm sure they'll likely add some more later on as DLC. Now, on a small final note, I like the small pieces of customization they added with being able to change the color theme of the arcade alongside having a profile section where you can see some of your stats. So, recommendation time. While I haven't finished the story yet, I have spent a fair amount of time in the arcade playing songs. So from what I've experienced so far, as long as you enjoy rhythm games, I'd say this one is worth a shot. And that wraps up part 2 of the games I've played in 2025. Once again, if you somehow made it this far, then thank you for watching. This is the first time I've ever made a video or honestly done any sort of project that's taken this long, so feel free to give any criticism or feedback on how I might improve for things I may potentially make in the future. As far as my personal takeaways go, I know I have a very difficult time putting thoughts into words, so the script likely wasn't the best, and I also think I should have committed to doing shorter reviews. Tried to keep things concise while also trying to dump as much information as I could, leaving things in a weird in-between where it's almost like I'm over-covering while not covering enough. Also feel like I struggled to find a balance between sharing my own thoughts on the game on top of just sharing aspects of it for those who might be unfamiliar. But anyway, enough of the negativity. Thanks again for watching, and feel free to leave any sort of video suggestions in the comments if you like. But yeah, that's all I got. Bye bye.